Hey everybody, welcome to the Song Lab podcast. Today, I got a special treat for you. Someone who's near and dear to Meredith and I. Unfortunately, my wife is not with us today, so I have someone just as cute. The inimitable, the legendary, the one and only Ray Hughes. And for those of you who don't know who Ray Hughes is, he's someone who's been just a tremendous influence in my wife and I's life. I mean, early days upper room, when we didn't know what we were doing, we were looking for language to try to figure out this thing around worship. And man, Ray just gave us permission to go after God and not to I'm already getting emotional talking about it, because it was the voice of a father that was like, hey, you don't have to have it all perfect. Try this or just try that. And he gave us permission to experiment with God and get out of the box a little bit. And so Ray was just a very influential person in our lives. He's a music historian. He's got some kind of doctorate in there somewhere. He's a prophetic music historian. He's a poet. He makes these beautiful pieces of art, these pens. The way I like to describe Ray is this. I said, if you were to mix Jeff Foxworthy with a quantum physicist, fill him with the Holy Spirit and give him a guitar, you got Ray Hughes. Welcome, Ray.
That's almost, I've had one other introduction. It's kind of like that. It's they call me a cross between Albert Einstein and Gomer Pyle. I think I'm probably a whole lot more Gomer than I am at Einstein, though. It's my journey has been by grace, and just there really was a grace thing that happened in me when I got saved, and I didn't even realize it, but it goes way back to all these little moments in my life that were just so much the hand of God, and I didn't even know it when they were going on, But really, it's been somewhere along the line, I discovered very quickly that my job was to marry truth and beauty and awaken wonder again.
Yeah.
And what I believe is going on today is there's not enough wonder in the world. They don't, no one even wonders who God is anymore. We've got so many pacifiers that have robbed us from so many of the beautiful things that God set in motion for us. But anyway, I didn't mean to jump off on all of that. I just had with the question you asked just before we went live was about my journey, and that's compelled me to go to a place very quickly that I didn't plan to.
Yeah. But
I've got an old pair of binoculars sitting over there on my shelf. And when I was 4 years old, my dad, he was a well digger. We were up in the mountains of West Virginia, and I was a 4-year-old little boy, and he reached in the truck and got those binoculars out, and he handed them to me. And he says, and we were standing on this mountain looking down in this holler there on top of a helicopter over these gas wells. And he handed me these old binoculars, and he said, here, look through this. Here, take this. It'll make you see far away. And I still have them. And that was high tech for us, a pair of binoculars.
Yeah.
But also I realized that a gift came to my life from my father that enabled me to see far away if I would pay attention, if I would be aware, and he instills some beautiful sensitivities and sensibilities in my life. I think they came through my blood. And I was always one that just kind of majored in paying attention. And when something would touch my life in such a way that I would feel, even to this day, something comes alive and quickens my spirit. It might be a thought. It might be a word. It might be a song. It might be a sound. It might be an ocean view, or the sound of waves, crickets in the night, whatever. Just the sounds always alert something in me. And I remember being repulsed by people when I was a little boy. When people would say, "Oh, that's just your imagination." Yeah, and we do that today. Why do we tell our kids, "Oh, it's just your imagination," as if imagination is something that's wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you don't want one of those in your life.
But shut that thing off.
Yeah, shut that
Just
down.
be boring.
I think the Lord wants to raise up Holy Spirit imaginators.
Totally.
That are full of wonder, that are that are compelled to believe that God wants to speak to them in every way that we'll listen. And all of creation is revealing him. If we'll just listen, if we'll just look, we'll just pay attention.
I think we have a generation that does use their imagination. They just use it in a negative way, and they get bound in anxiety and fear. They're using their imagination to project, a future scenario, and it's causing all this anxiety. And I talk about what happens if you flip that,
Yeah.
And instead of being
it's
bound
it's kind of like saying, do you know how to meditate? Have you ever done meditation? What? Do you know how to worry?
It's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Same thing.
It totally is, just in the wrong kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me this, so I love that. I love obviously the prophetic DNA was laid in there, being able to see far off and not just look here, the restoring beauty and wonder. I love all that. And as it relates to music, what made you do such a deep dive into music and studying music history and wanting to know about all of that?
Well, I think what did it for me was realizing how deeply I was impacted by music. And again, it might be that thing that I was born with, that sensitivity to sound and awareness of my surroundings and those kind of things. But, I can't remember a time when music didn't awaken something in me. And I dare say everybody has that. Just some people give it a different priority or different place in their life.
Yeah.
Because music is a force that God put in the earth that not only, let's imagine taking all the frequencies in the sound spectrum and then bringing them down to a controllable or movable. I hate to use the word manipulate, but you can manipulate those tones and frequencies and create melody and rise and fall and many way back in the early days, I mean, they played the music of the land. The sound of the land was important to a people in an agrarian or even a pre-agrarian culture.
Explain that.
Well, for example, to play the song of the land, music is universal. We always hear that musical is the universal language. Mm-hmm. Una is one, verse, song. So music is universal. Sound and song is also geographical. But more than that, when you start walking into it, then by the time you get to melody, that's topographical. And so many of the old Celts or the First Nations people, and some of them still do, they value land and value creation and creator enough that they want to play the song, the sound of that. So they'd look at the mountain range and they would play that mountain range that they're looking at as if it were written, scored music. Da, 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 da. You're playing the melody of the land. Also, even till this day, it's very well known in the First Nations culture that the young brave, when he was falling in love with the maiden down by the water, the brave would hide every morning waiting for her to come to the river to get water. And in his hiddenness, he would play the sound and the song of the river. And if you look at the edge where the water laps against the shore, he would use that to determine the notation. He would play that. And if she experienced the emotion, the passion, the beauty, the power of his song, she would call him out. And that's the way they would fall in love, to the sound of the land that they both carried in their spirit and their heart and their DNAs. It's a beautiful picture of overlooked. We're so bombarded by surface chatter and noise and next. We're so bombarded now by next that we never slow down enough to look back at the beauty of these things. And you don't make music. Music is something that occurs. Yeah. And when music occurs, there are those that have the sensitivities and sensibilities to be alert to it, capture it, like the brave did down there by the water, or like the old Celt who would be walking across the land that he considered to be so beautiful, and there's a old bird, lands on the limb, and he stops and honors the song of the bird because they believe that the bird carried the sound of heaven. That's why God gave them the ability to fly. And so if he's carrying the sound of heaven, I'll honor that sound coming from creation. is revealing the nature of God. They also believe that every color and tone and texture in heaven could be found somewhere on a bird's wing and on the feathers. So he was carrying that. So they would stop, honor the song, and then many times they would cut the fork out of the limb where he was sitting, and they would make a harp or a small harp called a timpani. And now they would be able to carry the sound of heaven, and they would be able to touch that sound. See,
Wow.
So there's so many of these wondrous and deep and beautiful things that just got overran with progress and next. And I think I got some of that. Your question is, where did I start? I think I got it from an understanding that I didn't have is my father was a well digger. And when
he was a well digger?
Yeah, he was a well digger. And I remember when I was a child looking over into an old well that my father dug. And I return to this all the time, Michael. Anytime I become a stranger in my own life, I find myself compelled to look into that well again. What I did is I looked down into a well and I saw the sky. And I've sort of been looking for heaven in old wells ever since.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it. Or I remember laying my head on the side of that well and listening to the world's oldest music. And little did I know that those kind of thought processes as a child would shape the journey that I would take. So when I came into the kingdom out of darkness and poverty and all kinds of dysfunction and abuse and all kinds of things were in our bloodline. But when I came into the kingdom, those things made their way over time, made their way back into my life in a beautiful, redemptive way. Thankfully, the dark stuff had to start submitting or yielding to the beauty of who God became in my life. And so now I look for that beauty every chance I get. And
Man,
to me, everything's a story. And it tells me who he is.
Yeah, and then it's like, how do you play that story?
Yeah,
play that story back to him. I love that imagery of that you're still doing what your father did. You're digging old wells. And I think what you've been able to do in our lives is looking back as you've dug these wells of history and music, and it's brought such life to us, and gave us inspiration to keep digging. The weird thing for me is I have no musical bone in my body, right? I don't play an instrument. I don't sing. I can't hit a note, but I'm like, I know the power of music and how it's shaped and influenced my life. And even now my gift set really functions a lot with music and sound. And because I think I listen a lot as well. I'm listening, for those divine inspiration moments constantly. I also listen with my eyes a lot, with how I see. I'm looking for God constantly in art and music and film and people and in the nature of my backyard. I mean, I stare at these windows all day and just look outside, and I'm like, God, thank you for where I live, like the beauty of what you've created around me. I get overwhelmed by it just talking about it,
Yeah.
And I love that music, I think, helps restore that wonder again. It really opens the eyes of our hearts to see in a different way. And what's crazy about it is how it seems like it can be such a beeline, so to speak, into another realm, into the realm of God. When we get stuck in these, like, the mundane of having to clean the house and cook and the repetitive things, where there can be beauty in that. Obviously, there's Brother Lawrence, who can find God in washing dishes. I haven't found him there just yet. But there's something about music and song that, man, it takes you to places that I can't get to on my own.
Yeah. Well, when music touches you emotionally, mentally, spiritually, even on a cellular level, even our nervous systems, everything that is us, all of our senses, and we know we have 5 senses. Well, no, we don't. Aristotle said we had 5 senses. We don't have 5 senses. Aristotle, some rattlehead years ago come up with the idea and put that in motion, and we believe it for how many hundreds of years now. But they've acknowledged now and recognized at least 21 senses. And every
Wow.
one of those sensory systems we have can alert to music, even down to us on a cellular level. Our brains and our bodies, we respond to music. We're musical beings. We think that this world is supposed to be understood, therefore logical.
Mm-hmm.
This world's not logical.
Mm-mm.
There's no logic. This world is musical.
Put this little seed in the ground, and then it's going to become this massive thing, this little thing. It's not logical. There's nothing logical about that.
Yeah. So we're now trapped in that deal where it's logical, we need facts. Jesus was not moved by facts. Jesus could care less about facts. They always imagine being those theologians and Sadducees and Pharisees and all those people in his day walk up and challenge Jesus on his facts and on his history. Our father on a certain mountain on this day did such. He didn't care about the facts, and he wouldn't stand around and argue with them either. You know what he'd do? He'd
tell a story.
He would just say, "Well, consider the lily," and walk off. Or consider the raven, and then he'd just check out and walk away.
Consider what's crazy. What's crazy about this is I've been thinking about this is how many parables he told, right? He was in story mode. And I started thinking about how many parables I've heard in church. And I don't think I've heard a parable in church before. Outside of someone trying to explain Jesus's parable.
Yeah.
And I've never, have someone teach
their
own
own
parables.
Let's bring logic to this. So let's bring logic.
Let's understand it.
Yeah. And if we can grasp it and understand it, then we get to believe it. And that chain of events starts happening in our lives. And pretty soon we wonder where the wonder went. Jesus would say, consider the lily. Well, that guy 3 days later, he walks up on a lily and he thinks, I wonder what he was talking about. And then God would begin to reveal himself through creation.
Yeah.
And or like you say, Jesus would just go off on some story. Wasn't even facts. If it had been fact, he'd have told the guy's name. But a certain man on a certain day in a certain bit. It's a story. He was accessing his own sacred tuition and listening to the desires of the Father, and he added to his creative process. And as he was telling the story, heaven was singing and awakening the spirit of those that would hear the truth. But they may have to go look at a star to get that, or look at a river or a grain of sand.
Yeah.
You
were talking about music affecting us on a cellular level. I've heard, and you were talking about the birds.
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about the purpose of the songbird in the morning. Could you explain that?
Yeah. Well, that's one of those cool things I ran across way back in the 90s, and it was actually called Sonic Flood. No,
Sonic Bloom.
Sonic Bloom.
No, that's the band.
Sonic Flood was a band that was in one of my meetings when I was speaking in Brownsville, and I was talking about the sound of many waters and all this, and they walked away with that name. They got out of the sermon and later called me and said, "Hey, would you meet with us?" And a bunch of wonderful guys, and they just wanted me to know that their band and their whole ministry thing wound up being drawn out of that, which is a picture of creativity. Everything that God ever created creates. So that's why wind makes more wind, fire makes more fire, grass makes more grass, flowers make more flowers, water makes more water. It goes on and on and on. And so should not the overflow of our lives and our encounters with the Lord, should that not also be creating as it's going forward? Because those guys having a creative ear, sensitivity, I didn't say Sonic Flood. I was just talking about the sound of many waters and I got into the sonic stuff that around that as it relates to the life of Jesus, the sound of the heart of the Father, the sonic. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But what happened though is years ago, I happened onto this thing where I heard about, what was his name? Carlson, I think was his last name. He was a young guy in the Korean War anyway, and he was stationed in a situation where poverty was horrid. And he was exposed to a mother taking her little small child, and laying him and letting a half track run over his legs so that he would become a more pitiful beggar. And he knew that the only way that he would be able to live is to be able to, if he in that horrid condition that he would be able to live.
Gosh.
I don't even know how to go there mentally.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a father and a grandfather, so I don't know how dark has it got to get.
Yeah, really.
But he saw this, a young man in the military. It crushed his heart. He committed that day. If this kind of poverty and famine will cause that to happen, I'm going to give myself to writing that. And so that became his mission. And so his mission was to correct that. And he was a bright young man, real studious type guy. Came back and he gave himself to that as his vision, to find the remedy for that, to break famine off of lands. And when he hired scientists and the whole bit, and he did all the research, and pretty soon he said, well, you know what was going on in the beauty of the Garden of Eden? Why? And that's when he started to do a study and research of what dew does to the horticulture or does to plant life.
Mm-hmm.
And then does dew come from the sky and fall on the earth, or does dew come up from the earth, or what? They realized neither. Dew does not fall and dew does not rise. When the atmospheric relationship between the heavens and the earth are just right, dew just becomes. And then they discovered that the dew would actually a few milliseconds or whatever right before dawn, that the birds were singing a very different song. And it was not a mating song, not a territorial song, and not any of that. Determined that it was a pre-dawn song. And when they would sing these songs, it would create a soundscape, and those frequencies that they released was actually opening the little pores or the stomata open in the plant life, causing the dew then to go deeper into that plant to the point that it would produce purity. And so anyway, through these studies, they determined which frequencies and how to project those frequencies toward plants. And sure enough, man, these guys kept down there doing it in cornfields and gardens. Are getting ears of corn, like 18, 20 inches long. Watermelons you can't get on a truck. Big old pumpkins larger than the bed of a truck. They're standing, I've got pictures of them standing on ladders to try to reach the top of the corn stalks. And then they started realizing that this acceleration of harvest was what they were after. And that there was a song that was welcoming an accelerated harvest. And I think that's one of the reasons there's so much emphasis now being given to those that are finding the pre-dawn song, is because we got a harvest coming. And it's going to be an acceleration of harvest. It's not going to be a long, drawn-out preparation. They could have 4 harvests in 1 year or 1 season because of these principles that they discovered.
Wow.
And his name was Dan Carlson.
Wow.
And his
we've been having these discussions around music and missions, and because I think so much of, what music has become, because like when David was out playing on the harps, in the fields with the lambs, he's not thinking about Spotify hits and likes and making money off his songs, right? He's just doing what he was, just responding to God, worshiping. And within that context, because I think we were just trying to talk about what's the focus of what we're doing in our creation. And I think that having a missional aspect to music, that there's a greater purpose for it than just making money or just getting followers and likes. And man, maybe it is to awaken the harvest. Maybe it is to open people's hearts up in such a way that they can receive the dew of heaven into their hearts to become pure again. And I love that idea. That's the sound, that sound in the song that creates purity. And I think when we see beauty, it purifies in some way, like your mind and your heart from all the junk that we see and that tries to get in. There is a purification process that takes place.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons. I've noticed there's a lot of folks that are leading worship that are supposed to be playing bars. There's a lot of people playing in the bars that are supposed to be leading worship. And there's a lot of people that are missing their purest calling as musicianaries, because once they give their heart to the Lord, they feel confined to religious systems and lose their wonder. And now they live their lives for the 20-minute opener in a church service somewhere.
Yeah.
And they don't carry the deep a deep understanding of their own life as it relates to music, because that's when they begin to create, musical surface chatter. And, but real musicianaries, but again, let's go back to the old days when the musicians and the poets, one third of scripture is poetry, by the way. And you have all this music and sound and art that fills the Word of God, and we miss so much of it by not understanding what David really did set in motion. And there were times in history where every culture, and we still do to a degree, but it's different now, every culture had the uniqueness of their bards. They were called bards or minstrels. In some cultures, they were called galliards. In the French culture, they might have been called troubadours. In the German culture, and troubadours and mine singers. And in the Viking culture, they were called skalds. Who were these people? These were the people that carried the sound of the song of the land. So they had the voice to speak to everybody and tell them who they were. Not that much unlike on this side, when, like with Scots Irish, those Celtic cultures, their songs came down. When we came across, we carried that. On this side, we still sung the songs of the Highlands because there was longing in us. We still sing the songs of Wales because we long for what's lost.
Yeah.
And then the mothers would lilt. Though they maybe not all know all the songs or the lyrics, while they're doing their chores, they're lilting. They're singing melodies and creating that musical soundscape of the home that not only tells the child that mother is there, she's not going away, not just tell where she is, but who they are. So they grow up and sing the high lonesome sounds and the sounds of the Monroes and the sounds of those. But also there was a time, Michael, when those bard, minstrel, singer, poet, troubadour, and in some situations, hobos that were carrying the sound of the song of the land. But back in the old days, a king would send out one of his minstrels to sing in all the villages and everybody in the realm. One of the things that they would do is they would carry story. They would also carry song, and what was called praise songs were directed to the king. So some peasant living in some holler somewhere in a little village in poverty is never going to get to be in the presence of the king. And the only way they'll ever even know their king and know who he is, anything about him, is how those creative ones would come and creatively reveal who he was. And so all they know now is the greatness and his beauty and his power and his ability to fight in battle and all these regal and noble things that they would learn about him. They would learn through the creatives, the musicianaries, if you will, the ones that were carrying the sound, carrying the song. And if you ever had an opportunity to actually go to the king's palace, when you walk in through the gate, it says, glorious and wondrous as you ever dreamed, even more so, because those creatives had also been the ones that knew the right seed to plant the right grass, to plant the right flowers, to draw the right birds that would sing this beautiful atmosphere. So when you walked into the presence of a king, you realized this is who he is.
Wow.
Now, who are we as musicianaries? People that are never going to know him, never going to see him, never going to experience him until we present him in such a way with such beauty and creativity that they begin to long for one they've never seen. And right now, nobody's longing. The world's not longing. They're finding pacifiers and counterfeits and look at what's happening to even the minds and mindsets of our culture today. We're not looking for the king. We're not looking. And so it's our job, yours and mine and Meredith's and everybody else's. We've got to get real and we've got to get authentic. We've got to get back to a pure enough place that those kind of songs can be heard that will awaken the wonder in people again. And they will start to wonder who God really is rather than they got him figured out.
Totally.
So it's a very different thing when you start looking at it from that creative perspective like that. And David's one of the ones that really accelerated that into God's people and into the Word, and gives us all permission to be far, isn't that something how most of our life is just looking for permission,
It's true.
There's a lot of musicians and songwriters right now that are trying to write according to clinics. And I think we need to have more songwriting clinics. That's not what I'm talking about. But if we make it so clinical, then we should not be wondering why our church services sound so clinical.